Welcome everybody to the Battle of Ideas lunchtime debate on physician-assisted suicide. My name is Helen Birtwistle and I'm the Communications and Resources Manager for the Institute of Ideas and Pfizer's National Sixth Form Debating Competition, Debating Matters, who are the partner of this session. Just to give you a bit of background to this debate, it's actually worth saying a few words about the competition. Debating Matters was set up 6 years ago because we wanted to give young people the opportunity to argue seriously about issues that mattered, issues and debates that were shaping the world in which we live. In contrast to established debating competitions in the UK, this wasn't an exercise to get youngsters to better their public speaking skills or to perfect debate as an art form or competitive sport. Debating Matters was set up because the Institute of Ideas wanted to create a space where young people could have a stab at grappling with some complex debates that were being had out in the real world. For that reason, initially, we had avoided the debate on assisted suicide, thinking that it was just too close to the ethical dilemmas that are posed in every GCSE, religious studies, or PSHE class across the country. It is therefore, I think, an indication of how important a political debate the assisted dying question has become that we decided that we had to introduce it as a debate alongside topics such as terrorism and civil liberties, nuclear power, privacy laws, clinical trials, and BBC funding, to name just a few. Having run this debate as part of the competition across the year, I know that there have been hundreds of articles published on this issue in just the last 12 months, with many of the country's best-known commentators coming out in favour or against a change in legislation. One of the most telling articles, I thought, came from Times columnist Matthew Parris, who began his article a couple of months ago by telling us that he had resisted wading into the assisted suicide debate. Resisted, that is, until now. So the assisted suicide debate is undoubtedly one where there are quite clearly demarcated sides, but it is also an issue about which many people are undecided and unsure as to what the ramifications of either side actually are. So I think that level of uncertainty makes this a critical discussion for us to have at the Battle of Ideas Festival this year. I'm therefore absolutely delighted that we have some of the most important thinkers and activists on the issue here with us today. So let me start the debate by introducing our speakers in the order in which they'll speak. So our first speaker is Professor Raymond Tallis. Between 1987 and 2006, Ray was Professor of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Manchester and a consultant physician in healthcare of the elderly in Salford. Most of his 200 research publications are in the field of neurology of old age and neurological rehabilitation. He's published articles in Nature, Medicine, The Lancet, and other leading journals, and in 2000 was elected Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences. Outside of his medical career, he's published fiction, poetry, and 18 books on philosophy, literary theory, the nature of art, and cultural criticism. In short, he's an intellectual of the highest order. So as well as being a great friend of the Institute of Ideas, the truth is that Ray is always thought-provoking and interesting, so it really is great to have him here to discuss the issue with us today. Our second speaker is Brendan O'Neill at the end there. He's the editor of the online magazine Spate and author of the green satire, Can I Recycle My Granny? And 39 other eco-dilemmas. He started his career in journalism at Spate's predecessor, Living Marxism, then its successor, LM, until it was forced to close in 2000, following a notorious libel action brought by ITN. Brendan writes widely for publications on both sides of the Atlantic. They include the New Statesman, Sunday Times, Slate, and the American Prospect, to name just a few. A few months ago, Debbie and Brendan went head-to-head on the issue of assisted dying for the Big Issue magazine. And it was precisely that exchange and just how interesting it was that made us want to give the pair an opportunity with others to continue and expand on that discussion. So it's really great to have Brendan with us today. Our next speaker is Debbie Purdy. Debbie, as you all know, I'm sure, is probably the most important figure in the contemporary assisted dying debate, and we really are delighted to have her here with us today. Whether you agree or disagree with Debbie on the issue, there's no doubt that she's impressed friends and adversaries with her determination and eloquence on the issue over the past few years. Debbie was a board member of the campaigning organisation Dignity in Dying before she gave up her place on the board to pursue her legal case to clarify the existing law. Debbie won that case in June 2009, and in September, the Director of Public Prosecutions published his guidance on the legislation. Debbie's victory has transformed the landscape of assisted dying, and during that legal battle, she was featured on major UK news channels and in news across the world, as well as being published in many newspapers. Actually, if you look at the Sunday Times magazine today, she's there as a day in the life, so do have a look at that later. And last but by no means least, we have with us Dr. Kevin Yuill, who's a senior lecturer in history and American studies at Sunderland University. He's now preparing a book outlining a humanist, libertarian case against assisted suicide. Previously, he's published articles in Spate, The Spectator, and The Tablet, and other journals on assisted suicide, as well as articles on the rise of therapeutic methods of governing during the Nixon administration, the sociology of Robert Ezra Park, and the origins of country music. And it really, a very important one. But it is Kevin's work on the issue of assisted dying that has consistently reminded us just what an important issue it is. So again, we're absolutely delighted to have Kevin with us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the speakers to take us through the issues. So Ray, if you could start, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. Thank you. It's a great privilege to be able to address this issue at this meeting. I've been delighted that it's been included under the topics we're going to discuss, because not only is it something that matters enormously to me, but it has become even more topical, partly as a result of the courageous work of Debbie. It's interesting, a few years ago, I might have been on the other side of the argument that we're presently having. When I was chair of the Committee on Ethical Issues of Medicine at the Royal College of Physicians, we twice considered bills put forward by Lord Joffe, proposing to legalise the choice of physician-assisted dying for mentally competent people with terminal illness who are suffering unbearably at the end of their lives. The case for such a bill, to me, now seems clear. Unbearable suffering, prolonged by medical care, and inflicted on a dying patient who wishes to die is unequivocally a bad thing. And respect for individual autonomy, the right to have one's choices supported by others, to determine one's own best interest when one is of sound mind, is a sovereign principle. Nobody else's personal views should override this. So where did my initial opposition come from? Well, I have to confess I was in thrall to numerous incorrect assumptions. But the evidence, I'm pleased to say, changed my mind. Now, several of my assumptions related to palliative care. Wouldn't assisted dying be unnecessary if optimal palliative care were universally available? This is not true. And I should have acknowledged this from my experience as a doctor for over 35 years, when I treated patients whose symptoms were uncontrolled even when they had first-rate palliative care. International experience also confirms that palliative care fails some patients. For the last 10 years, assisted suicide has been legal in Oregon under the Death with Dignity Act. Oregon has amongst the best palliative care of the 50 or more states in the USA, and yet nearly 90% of those seeking assisted dying come from within those palliative care services. I was also advised that the availability of assisted dying as an easy option would inhibit investment in palliative care. Again, international experience does not support this. In many countries, legalisation of voluntary euthanasia has been accompanied by increasing investment in palliative care services. In Oregon, the proportion of people dying in hospice care has more than doubled since the Death with Dignity Act was introduced. I also shared the worry expressed by some members of my committee that legalising assisted dying would break down trust between doctor and patient. But this was not borne out by the evidence either. A survey of 9 European countries put levels of trust in Holland at the top. And in fact, if you think about it, it's not surprising. In countries with assisted dying, discussion of end-of-life care is open, transparent, honest and mature, not concealed beneath a cloud of ambiguity as it is in the UK. And the knowledge that your doctor will not abandon the therapeutic alliance with you at your hour of greatest need will foster, not undermine, trust. I was also concerned that legalising assisted dying would take us to the top of a slippery slope leading to the involuntary euthanasia of people who do not wish to die. In fact, to use the ethicist John Harris's phrase, if there is a slippery slope, legislation would apply crampons rather than skis. In Oregon, where assisted dying legislation is close to the Joffe proposal, the numbers and kinds of people receiving assisted dying have not changed over a decade. And the Dutch experience, frequently misrepresented by those against assisted dying, was to me decisive. Rates of non-voluntary euthanasia have decreased since legislation was introduced. In the UK, by contrast, a study published in Palliative Medicine in 2006 and reinforced by a more recent study found that about 1 in 200 deaths were assisted, some of them without explicit request from the patient and without any kind of relevant legal framework. The present clinical, ethical and legal fudge in which ploys such as continuous sedation and starvation and dehydration are used to get round the prohibition on assisted dying is entirely unacceptable. I was also worried as a geriatrician that assisted dying would be offered to or imposed upon those who are most disempowered. A careful analysis of those who have assisted dying in Oregon doesn't support this. Well, these are the facts which are very inconvenient for the opponents of assisted dying, and they prompt me to change my mind. Even those who accepted these facts still oppose legislation on the grounds that only a small minority of dying people would seek assistance, and an even smaller number would use the prescription. Wouldn't legislation prove to be a sledgehammer to crack a nut, a leap in the dark which threatens all of us for the sake of a few people? Well, I happen to believe that even small numbers of people going through unbearable hell are important. The availability of assisted dying would bring much comfort to many more sufferers than actually use it, because it brings an all-important sense of having some control. Death from dehydration and starvation in patients who have no means of securing an end to their suffering, other than by refusing food and fluids, or botched suicides, reflect the unspeakable cruelty of the present law. To accede to someone's request for assisted dying, under the circumstances envisaged in the Joffe Bill, is not to devalue human life, or to devalue the life of a particular human being, or to collude in devaluing their own life. No, it is to accept their valuation of a few remaining days or weeks of life they do not wish to endure. Now, as a result of the courageous action of Debbie, those who are forced to assist their loved ones on grim pilgrimages to Switzerland may be confident they will not face prosecution. But we have a legal vacuum. Legislation of physician-assisted dying is needed urgently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. Brendan.
Thanks, Helen. I find it very peculiar that euthanasia has become one of the most politically divisive debates of our time, because if I had to think of one issue in the world which does not lend itself to simple political sloganeering or to the intervention of abstract laws, it would be euthanasia. It would be people's end-of-life choices. Euthanasia is not actually an issue you can be for or against. No serious or intelligent person is for euthanasia in the sense of actively wanting to euthanize people. And no serious or intelligent person is against euthanasia in the sense of having a bizarre blanket opposition to any form of voluntary death. For example, I actually admire the spirit of autonomy shown by Debbie and other people who want to ensure that they have control of their lives at all times. But that doesn't mean I'm for euthanasia. I'm also against legalising assisted suicide, and I'll explain why in a minute. But that doesn't mean that I'm against euthanasia per se. It means that I'm against formalising what ought to be, in fact, what has to be, a very informal area of life. You know, of all the areas of human life, death is the most ambiguous and the most ambivalent. You know, what might be an intolerable burden for some people is seen by others as something worth putting up with. You know, some people express a desire to die towards the end of their lives and then they change their minds. You know, this is no black or white, for or against issue. And this is not an area of life that can be or should be politicized or legislated for. And what I believe is that the recent transformation of euthanasia into a political and legal issue is having a detrimental impact on two groups of people. It's having a detrimental impact on those who want to live and it's actually having a detrimental impact on those who want to die. It's impacting on those who want to live because it seems unquestionable to me that the euthanasia campaign has become inextricably bound up with society's inability to value human life today. You know, quite separate, quite distinct from the desire for autonomy expressed by Debbie and others, the euthanasia issue gets its purchase today, I think, because society feels ambivalent about human life itself. You know, we live in an age when it is very rare to hear people talk about the wonders of human existence. You know, in fact, human life is most often depicted as something toxic and destructive. You know, this is most clear in relation to newborn babies and elderly people. You know, officials and campaigners frequently tell us how much carbon is emitted by each new person who's born, as if life can only be measured by its toxic impact on the environment. And our aging population, the miracle of our aging population, is always described as a crisis or a time bomb. You know, older people are depicted as a burden on social welfare and even as the harbingers of social instability. You know, Slate magazine recently said that old people should recognize that they are a nutritional resource for worms. You know, that is how older generations are viewed. And I think officialdom's interest in euthanasia springs from its ambivalence towards the value of human life. It's not interested in euthanasia because it respects autonomy. It doesn't respect autonomy. We all know that. It's interested in euthanasia because it finds it difficult to value human life itself. And I think that culture impacts on people who want to live, especially older people. I'm not arguing in some ridiculous Sarah Palin fashion that there are going to be granny-killing panels or that there's going to be a slippery slope and all these old people are going to be pushed into euthanasia. But I do think we will see a situation, if we don't already have it, where elderly people and other people will live their lives with a sense of themselves as burdens on society and as burdens on the planet. And that is not a good thing. And finally, I think the political and legal campaign around euthanasia has a detrimental impact on those who want to die as well. I think the formalization of end-of-life choices, the regulation of this confusing, ambivalent area of life, can make it more difficult and more traumatic for suffering people to exercise choice and autonomy. For example, as Ray mentioned, the Director of Public Prosecutions recently published 13 clarifications outlining when the authorities will not prosecute an assisted suicide. But he also published 16 clarifications outlining when the authorities might prosecute an assisted suicide. And what this does, it creates confusion. It makes things more difficult. It removes the initiative for that most private decision from doctors and families and patients, which is where it should lie, and turns it into something abstract and formal and creates all these hoops that people have to jump through. I've always thought that, you know, nothing human is alien to me, and the desire to die is a human thing. But what is alien to me is a society that cannot value life, and a society that is so obsessed with regulation and control that it even wants to regulate and control the darkest hours of our lives.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Debbie.
Thank you. I think there is some confusion about the terms we use and where we're using them. Euthanasia is not something that is being argued for by the people who campaign for the right for physicians to assist in dying. Euthanasia is when somebody else takes the action to kill you. Assisted dying and assisted suicide is when you take that action yourself. So that in Dignitas, for instance, they film people drinking the solution that will kill them, and a medical professional says, if you take this, you will die. Is this what you want to do? So the question of euthanasia has long since been not raised as the issue. But the law as it stands at the moment, okay, in 1961, legislation was passed that said, although it legalised suicide, to aid, abet, assist, or to to aid, abet, assist or procure or counselling, procuring, aiding and abetting the suicide of another is illegal, punishable by up to 14 years in jail. However, the current situation is that people commit suicide. People with multiple sclerosis, which is a disease that I have, are somewhere between twice as likely as the national average, and 14% of those diagnosed will attempt suicide. Now, those people are choosing to commit suicide before life is actually intolerable. They're choosing to commit suicide when they can physically do it themselves, i.e. when somebody else doesn't have to be asked to help them, or because they anticipate life will become intolerable and unbearable. I think that's unreasonable. If we're going to value human life, if you want to encourage people to make the most of the life that they have and value the life they have, we have to make sure that they know that if it becomes unbearable, there is solution that they can access. That we have mercy killings at the moment. So a number of people every year are killed by the people they love, possibly because they have asked for help to die, possibly because somebody else can't bear to see them suffering. But if we don't have a legal framework that makes sure that we know that it is the patient that requested an end to their life, not somebody else, then I think we have a very difficult situation, because those found guilty of what is termed a mercy killing, generally there is no stomach by the judiciary or a jury to sentence them to a jail term, so they're often the legal cases dropped, they're given suspended sentences and things like that. That doctors at the moment, 1 in 200 deaths are hastened. 20,000 doctors have admitted that they shorten people's deaths. But we have a ridiculous situation at the moment where if they ask their patient if they want to die, or if the patient says, I want to die, and the doctor then prescribes painkillers in a dose that will kill them, they have committed a crime. If they make a decision by themselves that the patient probably would prefer to have painkillers that end in their deaths, that's okay. So we are giving the responsibility to doctors to make end-of-life choices for people. And it's not their choice to make. If a doctor wanted to evaluate the quality of my life, he is likely to evaluate it lower than I would. Because as an able-bodied person, he sees what I can't do that he can do. He doesn't see what I can do that he can't. He can't experience the joy that I find in arguing with my husband. And that's important, that at the moment we have a situation where the law is a fudge. The law says very clearly that to assist or aid somebody to commit suicide or to counsel them is a crime, so that people who have travelled to Switzerland have travelled alone. They haven't had their partner with them for that horrific final journey because of the fear of prosecution. Because although it doesn't often happen, the point is it could do at any time. At the moment, Keir Starmer is our DPP. I've got a lot of confidence in him. But supposing we had somebody like George W. Bush, it would be a completely different situation. And I think that we have to be very clear that people who are making their own judgment, suggesting that the law remain unclear and that somehow benefits us, either in maintaining our lives or in ending our lives, it's crazy. They are making judgments themselves. The people who can currently utilise the clandestine things, if your doctor happens to be of the opinion that he is prepared to raise your morphine dose to a lethal situation, then your life can be ended. But that presupposes you have a doctor who is prepared to take that kind of risk. And it's not reasonable. The majority of people who go to Switzerland are articulate, financially viable, white, middle-class people. So leaving the law as it stands excludes vast numbers of people who don't have the money, don't have the wherewithal, and don't have the ability to articulate what they want. And that is wrong. A British law should not be either a postcode lottery that makes you dependent on how much somebody else cares for you and whether or not they're prepared to risk jail, or whether your doctor is prepared to take the risk. And I live in Yorkshire. Harold Shipman was trained in Leeds and practiced in Yorkshire for a long period of time, then went over to Ray's neck of the woods in Manchester. It actually scares people because they are worried because of the legal situation with double effect, that they are worried about prescribing enough pain medication to keep a patient comfortable, because the result will be that their life is ended. So I think clarity is never something to be scared of. The exact content of the law is something we must discuss, which is why debates like this are so important. That Ray has changed his mind from being against to for a change in the law. I have met people along the way that have made me realise that actually some concerns are seriously, honestly held and should be considered in framing a law. But we need to frame a law. It is not acceptable to leave it to coincidence as to whether everybody is covered.
It's
Thank you very
atheist, libertarian, and pro-women's right to abortion, and this immediately divides, I think, Brenda and myself from what I call the absolutists who insist on life. So we're by no means absolutist. So why then oppose the legalization of assisted suicide? I think there are two specific worries that I would want to point out about assisted suicide. It's not about the individual cases. I would absolutely stress that. It's not about individual cases at all. It's about the message that legalizing assisted suicide would give. So if we take the proverbial man teetering on the bridge, contemplating suicide, right now our message to that man, which I think everybody has, is to try and stop that man. And I think that's an important aspect of humanity. And what is being proposed here is to take a neutral stance. And I think that can be a very dangerous thing. I think in the name of autonomy, society will take a neutral stance towards suicide. And I think that is a fairly dangerous thing. So that's the first problem that I have. The second is with the regulation aspect that has been talked about. I think if we implement legalization of assisted suicide, it will result in increasing regulation in a sphere where government intervention is neither welcome nor appropriate. And this is part of a progressive regulation of human life and to be resisted in the name of autonomy. I think there's a few other points. Assisted dying, which is a term, I'm glad that this terminology has been discussed, because I think it is a suicide in the end. I think we have to be very, very clear about what we're talking about. You can talk about assisted dying, but realistically, it is assisted suicide. It relies in the end on the individual's judgment of the worth of their own life and on the individual actually accomplishing that act. So I don't think it's anything else. I think one of the problems with assisted suicide, I don't like the slippery slope argument either. I think it's not a very apt phrase. It doesn't really describe very much, and I agree with Ray Tallis's problems with the slippery slope. But I think the foot in the door metaphor is actually quite good. This is a foot in the door for suicide. And I think if you start defining, if you start saying unbearable suffering, this phrase that's used in the proposed legislation, this opens the door to anybody who sees their own case as having unbearable suffering, because how can we really justify saying that one person's unbearable suffering is not worth another person's unbearable suffering? So I think there's an expansive nature to this whole idea of unbearable suffering that's inherent in the legislation and is problematic. You can even see in the Keir Starmer report that just in response to the case of Daniel James, the very tragic rugby-playing 23-year-old, that suddenly it's not simply like the Oregon law, 6 months to live rules, it's suddenly expanded to those with an unbearable suffering in terms of their disability. So I think it's already expanded. We can actually see empirical evidence of that in I could point to Switzerland as well. The second very important point, I think, is the libertarian, what I call a libertarian case against legalizing assisted suicide. This will mean, as Brendan pointed out, this will mean less freedom and not more freedom, because it will regulate the deathbed scene. And I think this is a very important point about this. It will actually regulate the relations between doctor and patient. And I'm glad Debbie's raised that, because I think it's one of the most important things to actually know about this particular legislation. Around 3,000 deaths per year are caused by their doctors and have been done so for generations. This is not something new. Doctors have always, humane, good doctors, have taken this action in cases where it is humane to shorten a patient's life by a number of hours or days. And I don't think anybody objects to this. Certainly I don't. And I think nobody in the past objected to it. Not even the Catholic Church objected to this. And I think it's not worth objecting to now. And ironically, the peaceful deaths of these 3,000 will be jeopardized by the legislation for the sake of the estimated 650 or so who will take up the option. The doctors performing this act of kindness will be forced to fill in numerous forms, and the penalty in the UK proposed legislation is that if these forms are lost, the doctor will face 5 years, possible 5 years imprisonment. So this is not getting rid of regulation. This is actually imposing more regulations. And so those only wishing for their doctor to do the right thing at the end of life, this legislation ironically threatens that whole scenario. And to have a lawyer on the deathbed scene, I don't think is an improvement on a priest. As an atheist, I don't think having lawyers sitting there to actually do this, which is bizarrely part of the legislative proposal, is necessary progressive. So much of the justification of this legislation as of late is this ubiquitous quest for safeguards. And I think we really need to worry about when people are asking for safeguards. I think this inevitably means more regulation. And I think the spotlight on the deathbed scene is the real problem here. And I think this whole discussion is moving it along. And I see this as very, very problematic. And when it's mentioned, transparency transparency and everything else, I think that can spell real problems at the end of life. So the way we die will soon be, if this legislation is passed, as inspected and regulated as many of the aspects of the way we live that have been talked about at this conference.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. Now, I know from having spoken to them before that the panellists do want to respond to one another as well, but we are going to go straight out to the audience and get a number of questions from you, and then we'll come back and ask you to respond to some of those and one another. So, if I could have a microphone for that person here at the... Just there, please.
The bit of the conversation which I think is really interesting is the stuff that you raised around the wider cultural impacts and the wider cultural impacts. I think I've got a real problem with the stuff around regulation. I think it's an absolute furphy. It's for me, currently it's already heavily regulated. It's regulated by, it's a criminal offence. And I'm not sure, I don't know a huge amount of debate, I'm not sure why it can't be treated as a purely medical procedure, why it can't just be, rather than legalised, decriminalised. Doctors should be in a position where, working with their patients, they can make the same decisions they make about, do you want your appendices, well, not quite that, but like, do you want to have this medical procedure, or don't you want to have this medical procedure? There's no reason why it can't be that. That's not a major expansion of regulation. In fact, that's or a reduction in autonomy. It's shifting the process from one in which the state's making a decision, in this case, a really arbitrary, a sledgehammer approach of it is illegal, to one in which it becomes one that's governed by all the processes that govern the medical medical process. That's the first thing. The second thing in relation to it is the reason why it's again also not about autonomy is at the moment the situation is hugely arbitrary. The state gets to make the decision whether or not they're going to apply the law. And in terms of somebody that's opposed to state intervention, the idea that not only do you have legislation that says it's illegal, and so the state assumes the authority to make that decision, the state then also assumes the authority to try and say, but I will apply that when I fancy it, and maybe I will, and maybe I won't, and, oh, let's think, shall I today or shall I? And it's just, it turns the legislation into a really arbitrary process, and that is more about the loss of autonomy, because it's not even saying to the society, we'll hold this line, this is the law, argue against it and argue against it. It's saying the state will do what it wants, when it wants, how it fancies it.
Great, thank you very much. The woman in the pink top there, please.
I must say that, like Ray Tallis, I've to some degree been oscillating backwards and forwards between whether one should opt in favour or opt against, because on a purely human level, I value human life and want to believe that, you should hold on to it to the last possible moment. And for 1,000,001 humanitarian reasons, I can think of extremely good times when one might imagine contemplating death if one is in a predicament where unbearable suffering actually comes into it. My concern is actually much more with the foot in the door, which Kevin has talked about. Largely, if we do have legislation pro-euthanasia, I have to consider things like money management that happens in all hospital practices, where, for example, would it be cheaper to give somebody a single dose of medication rather than give them 4 months of palliative care? Would it be a factor that a doctor might be encouraged to persuade a patient that perhaps, a dose of, medication would be easier for him to give to this dying and probably very vulnerable and easily manipulated patient in such a situation, then, and suggest that maybe other patients could do with that money more? What about the situation where somebody has a family who is put through an intolerable strain, having to look after them? For example, my mother is extremely elderly, needs carers 4 times a day, 2 of them to come in. And it's a huge disruption to the entire family. I mean, I don't live with her, but my brother and sister do. Would she feel that as a mother, it would be easier on her children if she were to take the readily available dose and release everybody else from that burden? Would that be a factor? Would it be considered if she says of sound mind that actually I would prefer to die than to do this to everybody else? Once you have that legislation in place, all sorts of it's a huge hornet's nest that becomes opened.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Just behind that woman there, please, Evan. Yeah. Can everybody stand up, please, when they ask their question?
Hi. My name's Evan Harris. I'm an MP. I declare an interest as the leader of the House of Commons campaign to legalise assisted dying. I'd like to say to the lady in front that the evidence from countries where this is legal actually contradicts your concern. So maybe it's a valid concern, but I think we ought to be basing legislation on evidence. And if that was a concern, it's a concern that relatives are able to already pressure sick relatives into refusing treatment. They're perfectly entitled to do that, and there's rarely any check for capacity, let alone coercion in that. So if we're concerned about that, and I think we should be, there are many, many times more cases where there's no regulation, and in these cases there would be checks for that. I was interested to hear what the non-religious case would be. I was wondering whether it would be based on labelling this euthanasia or labelling it assisted dying. And I note that both speakers on the other side contradicted each other, one saying it was euthanasia, the other saying it definitely wasn't euthanasia. But I just want to make the point that I think Brendan's wrong to say that there's some establishment interest in euthanasia or assisted dying. The political establishment, the religious establishment, and the medical establishment are all against even having the debate, let alone legalisation. And it's only the public, actually, and I feel very uncomfortable being in a position where I support a popular campaign. It's unusual for me, but the public is overwhelmingly in favour of this against the establishment. And I think that's what we have to recognise, that this is a popular movement for respect of autonomy. And finally, I don't think you can argue that capacity and consent are inconvenient hoops that people have to jump through. They're fundamental checks against the danger of medical paternalism.
Okay, thank you very much. Just right behind there, That woman there. Yes. Oh, no, sorry, the one behind, just there. Sorry.
I believe the law should be kicked out of medicine altogether. I think it has a very corrosive effect. I don't think you can actually legalise a relationship, a doctor-patient, nurse-patient relationship. It's just not possible to regulate it. And I think there will be a kind of slippery slope as well. We have already seen a case where the Hippocratic Oath has been broken. I think we all know about the case of the 26-year-old who was allowed to die after a suicide attempt because the doctors were busy trying to scramble around to see what legal position they were in order to do that. And also, what's the point of having an assisted suicide law when you can have a nice living will, just a bit of scrap of paper saying, I want to die and don't treat me? And that came in 1994, so...
Thank you very much. We're going to come back to the panel now, and then I will come back out for some more questions. So if Debbie and Ray want to start.
Yes, I mean, the question of more legislation, the gentleman spoke in the front is absolutely right. We're not talking about a legislation-free situation. The law penetrates every single aspect of medicine. We've got plenty of law. We're just asking for better law, that's all. It's not asking for introducing brand new laws. The question, I have to respond to the man on the bridge. There is absolutely no comparability between a person who is in unbearable suffering, who has a progressive illness for which there is no cure, and who has a very short life expectancy, and who is making a decision with clear mind, and a person you come across about to jump off a bridge. If you can't make that distinction, then I think we have very few grounds for actually having a debate. And also the linking it with pessimism. I am a fully paid up optimist. I've written loads of books, including Enemies of Hope, and I should probably punish Brendan by suggesting you should read all 500 pages of it, because I'm totally against the pessimistic views that are going around. But I happen to be very realistic about the experience of a small number of patients at the end of life. I could say something about the foot in the door and so on, but perhaps we'll come back to that.
Yeah, Debbie.
There are two specific cases that were raised. One about a living will, which I think it is ridiculous to suggest that we've got a living will at the moment. The fact is, the doctors who were in that situation were looking at what their legal position would be, and some people might have chosen a different one, and it is possible that they will be taken to court to say they should have ignored her living will and they should have gone ahead and treated her anyway, regardless of the fact she had a living will. I think it is obvious that society failed this woman. She had attempted suicide 9 times, and she had been sectioned because her mental capacity was questionable. If that is the case and she had been released, it isn't the doctors on duty that night who failed her. It's 9 times she had attempted suicide. The mental health people had her sectioned, and still she went through that period, and she was released to go ahead and attempt suicide again. So I think she was failed, but it wasn't by the doctors on duty that night. Dan James was also raised, 23-year-old, young, physically active person who defined himself by his physicality, whose parents took him to Switzerland after 4 failed suicide attempts. I think it was far too early. It was only 18 months after the catastrophic injury when a rugby scrum collapsed on him. However, had there been a legal framework in place, and I don't agree with the idea that there is the legislation that is being discussed is necessarily the correct one. That's why we need a discussion and debate. But Daniel James, had there been a system in place, if he'd have said to his doctor, please help me, I want to end my life, the doctors could have said, listen, I'm not saying I won't help you, but first I want you to complete a 9-month, 12-month counselling situation. And they could have refocused his mind from, I want to end my life, this is unbearable, to something more positive. And that wasn't available to them. All they could say is, either we won't talk about it, or no, you can't do that. And the fact that he didn't have the physical ability to successfully take his own life, which is a completely legal action, meant that he ended up going to Switzerland with family. If we have a legal framework in place, it's not a dangerous thing that gets the government involved in something. It means that we can carefully look at and make sure that alternatives are discussed, that somebody talks to a doctor and they are able to breasts, maybe moving somebody into a different social situation, changing their pain management framework. Those things are all possible, but they are not possible unless we have a framework that encourages proper open communication between doctors, social workers, and the people who are able to offer help, and the patient who finds their life unbearable.
Okay, thanks, Debbie. Is that Brenton, if you want to come in?
Yeah, I think it's disingenuous of Evan Harris to present this as a kind of groundswell public campaign to change the law with this kind of stuffy political establishment resisting it. I mean, it may be the case that there are elements in the political establishment who don't want to have the debate or make any changes, but people are not marching through the streets for the right to die. And I think the origins of the campaign, the kind of campaigning base, if you like, is quite revealing. You know, Debbie described very well the people who go to Switzerland as white, middle class, fairly well off. I don't think that's just because they're the only people who can afford it, which I think is what Debbie was suggesting. I think it's also because that is where this campaign comes from. It comes from influential groups in society. It comes from liberal commentators. It comes from people like Evan Harris. It comes from that milieu in society. And I think that is revealing in itself. It's a cultural dynamic. And it's true that opinion polls frequently suggest that people support the idea of the right to die, but then the minuscule number of people who actually end up exercising that right is very interesting. That kind of disconnect between people who say they support the right but then not take it up is quite revealing. I think, just quickly, sometimes a fudge is better than clarity, especially when the motivation of the clarity is further regulation and further control, and what Kevin described very well as the kind of lawyer at the deathbed scene. You know, this is an area of life that cannot be whittled down to a list of rules and regulations of when suffering is so bad that you can die, when it's acceptable to someone to help you and when it isn't, who can put the injection and who can't. These things cannot be defined in that way. It's just bizarre. And I think it's important to recognize that what campaigners are asking for is the right to die, and effectively they're seeking the state's permission to die. It's a campaign for recognition, state recognition of their right to die, and I think that's a very dangerous thing because it's putting ordinary people and our choices in an inferior relationship with the state.
Thank you. Kevin?
Well, a couple of points. First of all, you know, it's a bizarre idea that this is a simple operation. This is kind of the last operation that you'll have. You know, there's a lot at stake in this whole thing. I don't think you can sort of reduce it to a simple operation. We are talking about death. And right now, it's, you know, even in the proposed legislation, and from what the other speakers have said, it's not a simple thing at all. It has to have a 2-week cooling off period. It has to have a legal affidavit to prove that the person is psychologically able to make that decision. This is not something that's ever going to be boiled down to be something simple. It is something that you have to have these regulatory, the apparatus around if you're going to put through this legislation. And that's what I think we're talking about. Evan Davis, yes, I absolutely agree. We should have this debate, and I would really like to challenge, I like this opportunity to challenge, actually, dignity and dying, about the question of autonomy. Is it autonomy or is it mercy? If it's autonomy, you must trust the person themselves. It has to be every suicide, because a 21-year-old suffering from a romantic problem can, you know, has an equal say to say that they are unbearably suffering as an 85-year-old suffering from cancer. I'd love to know exactly how you justify that division, because I don't see that you can do it. If you either have autonomy or you have this bizarre set of regulations that actually divides people into two separate groups, the dying, or the people whose lives we don't think are actually worthwhile keeping, and the people that we're going to try and patronizingly say, yes, you don't have to do it. It can only be done individually. This is about, you know, I can understand individual cases. I don't think, as Brendan said, you can reduce it to a flow chart. If somebody comes up with this, then we can take them here, and we can't have a bunch of little categories in which we place people.
Thank you. So we're going to go back out to the audience and get another range of questions before coming back. This lady at the front, please. Can everyone try and be fairly pithy, because we don't have that much time left?
I have a real problem with this issue. I am very conflicted, and I have a huge presumption in favour of life. I think that being an atheist really helps that, actually, because you know that this is the only shot that you're going to get at it. And so you really do want to cling on to it. On the other hand, I can quite understand why for some people life is not worth living and they should not be compelled to go on with that. And actually my understanding of that extends to Daniel James. Actually, I can quite understand why being totally paralysed might mean that you wouldn't want to continue your life if you valued sporting activity to the degree that he did. And I think that that's completely understandable. My problem is, and it's really two questions to really put forward. My biggest problem with this whole area, and where I want to be convinced by Debbie's side on this, is about the regulation side of it. Because I am really concerned about the sense of introducing more laws and more regulation into an area that I think is quite rightly described as being ultimately personal and unregulatable. And I find that really, really difficult to work out how you can actually do that. On the other hand, I do have a problem because, you know, as people have said, medicine is already regulated at the moment. There are laws, and I do find that Debbie's argument about at the moment we have an environment that is not likely to prosecute her partner and so on, but we won't always have that, quite a compelling one, because it's difficult to see how people can operate properly in circumstances where things are completely fudged and unclear. And as somebody who's fundamentally opposed to the regulation, I do find that troubling, and I'd like to know how we get around that particular thing. The one argument that's put by Kevin and Brendan's side that I'd like to challenge you on, though, because I have a real problem with this, is the idea that these personal decisions and so on, and people's very difficult practical circumstances, are somehow sending a message to society and reinforcing a particular climate. And perhaps the reason why I am really bothered about this is because as someone who works in the field of abortion, I'm told continually that a law that allows for termination on grounds of, say, Down syndrome is sending a message to society about withdrawing resources from people who have disability, or is somehow eugenic in its intent, or somehow devaluing life and people with Down syndrome, which I honestly think is absolute nonsense. I'm really on the John Harris side of the slippery slope. Being a skier, I think that slippery slopes are to be skied and negotiated. This is a really difficult area. I think the ultimate question is how do we resolve, as people who are politically motivated, a situation where you have a practical personal problem that is not coped well with within the existing framework. And that's the problem on one side, with the problem of a growing political climate that doesn't value a kind of environment that has a kind of value of life and the meaning of life in the way that we want to have it. But it's how we overcome that dichotomy in the situation, which I think is genuinely deeply problematic.
Thank you very much. If I could have that man there with the blue shirt on in the middle, and then right at the very back. Yes. Very quick, please, because we do...
I instinctively support Brendan and Kevin, but I'd really badly need them to address critically the actual experience of the places where this has been tried, as indeed Ray Tallis has done. And I'm afraid that until this is done, you might be guilty of ignoratio elenchi or arguing to the wrong point.
Thank you. Right at the back then, please.
Just to say, I think it's, I'm not quite sure that it's helpful to dissolve the issue into kind of broader cultural problems or to make it solely a question of the quantity of legislation. I think it is possible to kind of clarify particular laws given that the area is already regulated, but the question is whether those laws track the underlying issue. And individual autonomy is shaped by social context. So I do think that if you have a social context which shifts the boundary even slightly in presumption of ending life, then I think that is very dangerous. Even if the numbers don't particularly increase in people taking up the option, I still think as society, the emphasis should be obviously on valuing life. There are situations where individual would choose to end their life, but it's very separate if you view it from an individual viewpoint and from a social viewpoint. But I think that can be kept separate from the question of whether we need legal clarity in particular medical situations. We probably do. So I think it's important to keep those two aspects distinct.
Thank you. That woman in the blue, please.
Yes, well, I don't think you can separate the legal questions from the social questions. And the point I wanted to make was around Ray Tallis's argument about palliation, right? I don't think you can bring in evidence from the places that have introduced this legislation, actually. You yourself said there are very tiny numbers of people involved. So your evidence, in fact, comes from a very tiny sample of people. And I don't think it's justifiable. Just because coincidentally Oregon has good palliation does not mean to say, that that's in any way connected, with whether or not they have legislation on the question of assisted suicide. I think the issue is that whether or not you have good palliation is very much a social question of where we spend our money and where we invest in developing medicine. You said yourself that our palliative system is very much postcode related. It can be very poor. It can fail people. But actually, if the message you give to people is, well, we have to deal with that situation, rather than this is an area where human beings can actually make a decisive difference to the quality of life and change the whole meaning of the quality of life. We're not just talking about physical things. We're not talking about the physical handicap or anything else. We're talking about the qualities of life, which involve a large number of other things. Arguments with our husbands, love of our children, any number of things comes into the equation of quality of life. So I really challenge you on that whole question of palliation.
Thank you. It's going to be one person between you two, I'm afraid, so...
Fight.
I'm wondering whether it really is the job of the law to send messages or whether it's to define what's acceptable and what's not. Because otherwise, what is the point of laws?
Thank you. So I'm sorry, we're done on time. I'm going to come back to the panellists and give them a very short chance to respond to some of those questions and then to summarise afterwards. So, Debbie.
Can Ray go first?
Ray can go first. Yeah, of course.
Thank you. I mean, just dealing with the issue of palliation, I wasn't making a false post hoc ergo propter hoc argument, in other words, that palliation improved after the legislation was introduced. If you look at countries like Belgium, they totally reviewed their palliative care services before they looked at liberalisation of their laws. So there is actually a clear causal connection rather than merely a temporal coincidence. Secondly, I have to pick up on the issue of autonomy. What this law offers is an expansion of autonomy. We're not talking about boundless autonomy. When a law is permissive, it expands autonomy in a direction one approves of. It doesn't mean to say autonomy is going to be boundless. And autonomy also always has to be understood, I think, as Philip Cunliffe said, in a social context, although I just interpret the context a little bit differently from him. And finally, the question of evaluation of life. I was sort of a bit disappointed. I thought I'd covered that. Basically, if I decide towards the end of my life, in an appalling illness, in an appalling situation, I do not wish to carry on for the next few weeks, I'm not devaluing human life. I'm not retrospectively devaluing my own life. I'm just saying that the value I place on the few days or weeks that lie ahead is negative for reasons that will be blindingly obvious to everyone. So we have to keep on making these distinctions. It's not about the value of life. It's about evaluation of a particular phase of a particular life.
Thank you.
Made by the person themselves, I hasten to add, not by somebody else.
Thank you very much. Kevin, do you want to?
Okay, yes. A couple of things. First of all, the sending a message kind of aspect, and it touches on what Ray was just talking about, because I don't think that an individual taking that particular action does necessarily send a message. I think it's much more, this is a sea change in our attitude. That's what I'm trying to actually convey towards suicide, and I think that's an important thing. I think for instance, if you take abortion, just to take this lady here's point, if you take abortion, one of the reasons I'm in favor of abortion rights for women is because I think valuing a group of cells above that of an adult woman does send an extreme message about how we value life. And one of the criticisms I'd make of the pro-life campaign is the fact that they do this. They take an inanimate group of cells and make it equivalent to a human life, an adult female life who is going to have problems because of not being able to have an abortion. So I think there is a message in there. I do think there's a political implication to this whole thing, and I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that there's no message that we are giving if legalization takes place. Not the individual cases, I agree about that, but the actual legalization. Secondly, I think in terms of evidence, interesting question, I agree that the evidence is very, very small. It is, something like less than 80 people per year in Oregon. But what we can point to as evidence in Switzerland, which I think is kind of interesting, is that they allow people to come into Switzerland to have suicides for various different reasons. So, for instance, one of the reasons that a Canadian woman recently went in was that she was depressed after her husband died, and there was nothing physically wrong with this woman. And you can see the sort of expansive nature of this whole thing, because how can you deny this woman's unbearable suffering compared to somebody else? Ultimately, Ray, you cannot, the man on the bridge, if you trust his judgment, you have to have a neutral stance towards him, and I think that does make a big difference. And just very lastly, Ray, I mean, just on that last point, I think if there was ever a fudge, I've heard, it's about your definition of autonomy. I think either where does this, you're sort of drawing lines at very random places between autonomy. I think if you talk about who is in charge of deciding when a human life is worth having and worth not, or not worth having, you have to trust the individual. And this is the logical end of the assisted dying campaign. It is very much about promoting autonomy, and that is about suicide.
Okay. Brendan.
Yeah.
Sorry, Debbie, I'll come to you.
I didn't say that these individual cases send a message. In fact, I said the exact opposite, which is that I argued that the campaign around euthanasia, officialdom's interest in euthanasia, springs from an already existing culture that finds it difficult to value life. The message has already been sent, and then I think the way in which euthanasia is discussed reflects that. In particular, I don't think that the individual cases that we've been talking about send any message in and of themselves. Absolutely not. The problem is their elevation by certain parts of the political establishment, by certain campaigning groups, and their transformation into evidence of why we need new rules and regulations, as if all those individual cases can be pulled together and turned into a message about how all of us should live the last days of our life. That's what I find really objectionable. That is to brutalize those individual cases by abstracting them and turning them into some lesson for society. So absolutely they don't send a message, but it's really inhuman, I think, to expect them to, which is not something that I expect them to, it's something that campaigners expect them to. I think Ray is right when he talks about, there is a narrow judgment on the value of life that is made in these individual cases, and a lot of the time it's a perfectly legitimate judgment that the individual has made him or herself, or that the doctor has made, or as part of the family, or whatever. But I think Ray can't ignore, or rather he shouldn't ignore, the crossover that exists between those individual valuations of human life, which are often legitimate, and the broader cultural devaluation of human life. And it's the interplay between those two things that I find really worrying. It's the co-option of those individuals' difficult valuations of life into this kind of culture which devalues life in general. And I think the human approach to this issue is to untangle those two things so that we can respect the autonomy of people who are in severe pain or in severe suffering, and have a more serious upfront discussion about the culture of life in society.
Thanks, Brendan. Debbie.
I'll be dead quick. Two things. One is, I'm old, but I'm not that old to remember what it was like before abortion was legalised. But I do know there were a lot of backstreet abortions. Women died in order to control their fertility. And the current situation is that suicide is not illegal. People make botched attempts. People who physically have problems make terrible, attempts on their lives. But suicide is actually a legal thing in this society. So legalising physician-assisted suicide takes that out of it. And I think to make people safer is important. It has got a social context that the majority of people going to Switzerland tend to be white, financially independent and middle class. However, it has long existed in cultures where family is more important, that things like this just don't get reported to the police and don't get discussed by outside. But that is not the society in which we live in general at the moment. Therefore, we need to have a proper discussion about what safeguards should be in place and what legal rights people have to control their own mortality. And I think just generally, it is not reasonable to talk about there's only a few people, it only affects certain groups and so on. If it affects one person, if one person's life can be extended, that is worth changing the law for. If one person doesn't go to Switzerland because they know they can ask for help in the UK in 3 months' time, that is the biggest reason. If politicians can spend time in government, in Parliament, discussing how their expenses should be organised, they can damn well discuss how to protect people's lives.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Thank you very much indeed to all of our speakers for really speaking so incisively about that very difficult issue. Just to say that we are encouraging people at the end of each of the sessions to really think about joining the IOI. It's very important in terms of putting on more debates like this, that people actually do go on and put their money where their mouth is. So please do pick up a form and fill it in. Thank you very much, everybody.